Hi there, I'm Andrew Chamberlain from Consort Strategy, and I'm going to briefly talk you through the process for writing a policy. Please don't worry too much about jotting down notes through the next few slides. I've put together a more detailed piece of guidance for you so that after this session, you've got a reference point. Although everything I'm talking about here is covered. So certainly, there's all the information you need will be captured in that document. If, however, when you're writing your policy, you need more advice or input or just got some questions, then you can see my email address there. And by all means, do please get in touch with me, and I'll do what I can to help. I think for me, when we're starting the process of writing a policy, we should keep in mind some of the principles that we want to adopt. Fundamentally, it needs to be simple. The policy needs to be understood by everybody. We want the reader to know something. We want the reader to do something. We want the reader to comply with something. It's a rule, it's a process, it's a procedure. We don't want to make it overtly complicated. Instead, we want it to be recognizable and accessible. It needs to be easily read. It needs to be easily understood. And regardless of what policies we're writing, how many we're writing, we want to make sure that the format is consistent and that I, as a reader, be it as an employee or a stakeholder or anybody who's interested, potentially someone who's buying my services, they need to understand and recognize the sections and the subsections of the policy and be able to read it without difficulty. When writing a policy, do some research and be familiar with the subject matter. Ideally, when you're writing a policy, you'll bring in some external experts in a subject area, people who are familiar not only with the specific subject of the policy, but people who are familiar with the goals, the purpose, the objectives of your organization, how it's run, what its internal functions are, etc., so that they can write a policy that is highly relevant to you. If you can't bring in somebody externally and it's incumbent on you to prepare the policy, as I say, do some research. Make sure you're comfortable and confident in the policy writing. The last thing we want to do is for you to create a policy that actually is wrong and leads you to more or to unwanted areas of trouble. I think probably to help with that research, you might want to go along the interview people, interview some employees, discuss relevant topics with them, or go outside the organization and speak to people who are expert in the subject, and absolutely make sure you're identifying any laws or regulations that correlate with the policy. As much as possible, include your team in the development process. The best way to ensure compliance with the policy is to encourage a sense of ownership of the policy. And the best way to do that as much as possible is to ensure that members of your team or anybody who's going to be impacted by the policy or has to be compliant with the policy has had an opportunity to contribute. That way, they are far more likely to have a positive attitude about the policy and are far more willing to enforce it and comply with it when it's published. I think crucially as well, once the policy is written, that of course is absolutely critical. We've got to write it, we've got to publish it. Once it's written, what we then want to do is make sure that we go back and routinely review. The worst, I would argue, worse than having no policy is having an outdated policy. I think it's really important that we put in place a process where you perhaps review annually to make sure that the content is still relevant, the content reflects any perhaps changes in legislation or regulation, reflects any amendments or changes in internal operating practices, or responds to, externally responds to economic or market changes. Do not overthink it. As I said at the start, We want our policy to be as simple and as straightforward and as accessible as possible. Complex rules that are underwritten with copious amounts of explanatory text are only going to be perceived as impenetrable. And they're certainly going to disengage me as a reader. I'm not going to want to spend hours and hours trying to work my way through a compendium of encyclopedic knowledge about a certain policy. Make it simple, don't overthink it, don't overcomplicate it. Do some sense checking, particularly if you've been responsible for doing the research around the area as well. Get an extra pair of eyes to look at them and read through the document. Both an expert pair of eyes to make sure that what you're writing is correct, but also, a non-expert perspective, so that actually you've got somebody reading the document with a fresh perspective. Does it make sense to them? Do they understand what's required of them? Is it relevant to them? Often, when you're in the midst of writing a policy, it can be difficult to not see the wood for the trees. And often, I've done it, you write something, you think it's obvious, and then someone comes along and reads it and says, that's great, but you haven't actually just put the title on the policy. I don't even know what this relates to. So things like that are really important to make sure, as I say, that it's correct, that any mistakes have been eradicated from the draft. I know it sounds obvious, but get sign off for the policy. You may have written something fantastic, but if senior leadership hasn't endorsed it or agreed it, then it will be almost impossible to enforce it. Write clearly and concisely, and crucially, write in the third person. So doing so ensures that the policy is understood, that it is applicable to all and everyone, and that it's not something that you've written specifically just for you and your benefit. As best you can, try not to include any data that's going to easily be outdated. The last thing we want is to have to be going back in and updating policies on a monthly basis because of market data that's been referenced, or because there's legislative or regulatory changes that we know are happening and that are constantly requiring us to update our pros. That just becomes a cumbersome process, and we don't want to do that. Balance your language, I think, is really important. If people feel a policy, if it is being imposed upon them, if they are being commanded to do something, then they become a lot less responsive to the policy. However, if they feel that they're being cajoled and encouraged to do something, and it's clear to them why, and that actually they recognize that doing so is a good thing, particularly if they've been part of the development process earlier on, they're far more likely to be receptive to the language and the purpose of the policy, and to observe it. Ensure any acronyms are understood. TLAs, three-letter acronyms, just blow people's minds. And everybody thinks they've not got any, or that they've got a million, and that they're really easy to understand. Assume that nobody understands the acronyms. So write the phrase in full, write the organization's name in full, bracket it afterwards with the acronym, and then use it. But absolutely be clear on everything that you're referencing. Keep it short. Like I said earlier, we do not need reams and reams and reams of paper. Not every detail of every context needs to be articulated in the policy. Only, that said, only if it's a really complex process that needs a lot of detail. Otherwise, writing an extremely long policy that's tantamount to reading a book just means the readers become disinterested and they never get to the end of it. And they'll never, therefore, be able to enforce it. Ensure compliance. Again, it's one of those things you think, well, this is obvious, but actually the last thing you want to do is write a policy that contravenes the law and gets you and or your business in trouble. And certainly you don't want to write a policy that puts the management or any of your employees or any of your customers or clients or stakeholders, anybody involved with the organization at any risk or in any danger. So do please make sure that you ensure compliance with the relative legislation and regulation in the country that you are working. Make sure the policy is read. How often have you seen a policy published, or perhaps you've tracked Google Analytics and realized that no one's looked at the document, no one's downloaded it? I think it's a really good practice to ask people to confirm that they've read the document, that they've understood the document, and ask them if they have any questions with regards to the document, because and ask them to confirm via email. It's a real proactive way of getting them involved in the discussion around the policy, if nothing else. If you don't want to use email, have them sign it afterwards and send back, an e-signature or something like that. There are many ways of doing it, but there's certainly, I think it's a very, very good practice to get people to acknowledge receipt and reading of the document. And then finally, on terms of the principles, follow up with training if required. I think one of the things that we're very good at when we write in policy is forgetting that actually sometimes people don't have the skills or the expertise or the knowledge to be able to enforce the policy or to comply with the policy. If we're implementing something, if we're implementing a policy, it's only right and fair and proper that we make sure everybody to whom it applies is able to comply. So if, for example, there's a tech, perhaps there's an IT policy that you need to put in place, the use of computers, or perhaps there's a policy around expenses or travel and subsistence, don't just assume that people understand. Give them some guidance on it if they need it. If they need training, give them some training. It's only fair, it's only right, it's only proper. Okay, so with those principles in mind, what does the structure of a good policy look like? Well, as I said earlier, I think it needs to be, as simple and as straightforward and as accessible as possible. And so here there are just only really 9 guiding principles. Number 1, be explicit in explaining to whom this policy applies. Again, you may write something fantastic, but if I'm not sure that it relates to me and that I'm supposed to be applying the policy, doesn't matter. Just a simple explanation that just says this policy applies to all staff, or to staff and board members, or this policy applies when we are engaging with our customer network, blah, 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 something like that. Make sure you include dates and version numbers. Avoiding any confusion, include details of when the policy was first enacted, when it's been updated, and what version people are looking at. The last thing you want is people to be reading previous versions that are no longer relevant, that have been superseded by internal developments or external developments. So make sure that that is clear as well. Articulate, explain who has approved the implementation of the policy. Doing so will enforce it and will help to ensure observance. If I think that my colleague down the corridor who's got a bit of a beef about something has just written a policy because they're a bit disgruntled, whatever, probably not going to be bothered too much about it. If, however, I know this has been the policy has been devised, is supported, and is endorsed by senior management or the board of directors or the leadership team, well, that gives certain gravitas and authority to the policy, and I am far more inclined to, if nothing else, follow those rules. The policy statement in the document is where you state in detail why the policy exists, why it's being created, answering any questions as to who, why, what, when, and the where of the policy. So this is the chunky piece of content. This is the meat on the bones, if you like. Linked to that is the scope of the policy. So ask yourself whom and what the policy applies. So for example, if it's for staff conduct within the organization, or is it for salary payment processes, or is it to do with annual appraisal processes? That is the scope of your policy. make it clear, make it absolutely understood that the who, why, what, and when is given a context, and that's the scope of the policy. I think it's important to recognize that policy is and procedure are not the same thing. So the policy is articulating what we're doing. The procedure articulates how we're doing it. That said, it is okay to indicate the steps within the policy, to indicate the steps that will help to achieve the goals that are laid out in the policy statement. So, articulating the rules that need to be obeyed, and detailing, articulating that within a process map is appropriate. Be clear about whose roles and responsibilities are what in relation to the policy. Who is responsible for complying, who is responsible for enforcing the policy, and if you need to include contact information there, because what you want is a virtuous cycle whereby if I'm reading the policy and I think, oh, this needs updating because I can't comply with this because I know such and such has changed. Make it easy for me to get in touch with someone and say, hey, do you know that we need to update our policy because this is different now. So make sure that information is there. If required, now I know I spoke earlier on about cajoling people rather than commanding people. However, if there is something that is absolutely mandatory, particularly if it's around health and safety, or any piece of legislation around employment legislation, equality, diversity, and inclusivity, or anything that is absolutely mandatory, and if you don't do it, you're going to break the law, or you're going to be in a case of gross insubordination, and you're going to be up against potentially a tribunal. Let's avoid that by being directive and absolutely explicit on what is mandatory. And finally, include a glossary of terms. I think, let's not assume that everybody who's reading the policy knows the ins and outs of our language as well as we do. Don't be afraid of taking it right down to the most basic level. Better that we do that than we make an assumption and we end up with quite a bit of confusion around the language or the purpose or the direction of the policy. I think finally, and one thing I've not written here, but I have included it in the guidance, is formatting. I know it sounds bizarre, but formatting is really important. We want the document to be accessible. We want the document to be readable. So I think it's really important that it is a policy is an official document. So we want it to look professional. We don't want it to look like Mickey Mouse has written it. So we want to use one of the more accepted professional fonts, something like Arial, Garamond, Times New Roman, etc. And I've no doubt the organizations in which you work have style guidelines. Obviously, make sure you adhere to those when writing your policy. Use space appropriately as well. The last thing again you want is 16 lines of text, font 8. No, make sure it's spaced out. 12 font, 14 font. Decent spacing so that I as the reader can get into it easily. Clear headings, sections are absolutely understood what each, what they're talking about here, what I'm talking about there. I know it sounds obvious, but it's one of those things, if you get it wrong, no, rephrase that. If you get it right, nobody notices. But if you get it wrong, it's a whole house of pain for you. So you may as well make the effort, and get it right first off the bat. Don't use color. Don't use color. It just confuses things, and you want your policy to be just in black and white as much as possible. If you do need to use some color for emphasis or to illustrate examples, that's okay. Of course it is. But don't go, writing in red text or color coding the policy or anything like that. It just will lead to confusion and will look unprofessional. And I think crucially as well, to make sure that the document is easily understood. the spacing piece, not just the use of space, but the spacing of paragraphs, sections, subsections, all needs to be considered. It prevents, words becoming cluttered, clustered in one sort of, block of black ink. Instead, it helps the reader understand, where the important sections lie, where the relevant sections to them are. It just makes the whole piece a lot more accessible. So yeah, so those are my tips and guidance on how to write a policy. As I said, I'm Andrew Chamberlain. That's my email address, andrew.chamberlain@yourconsort.com. You're always very welcome if you've got a question about policy writing or anything. I'm as part of your work with Go for Growth, then do please get in touch with me. Always happy to answer questions or to help where I can. Okay, bye-bye.